If you enjoy our podcast, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal to help us bring you more content like this. You can find this episode and all of our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website, abqjournal.com, as well as YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. See the show notes for a discount code on a digital subscription. Thank you for supporting the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico's leading news.
Welcome back to Rounding Up the Roundhouse, the legislative podcast for the Journal. I'm joined today by Dan Boyd, our Capitol reporter. Today is Friday, February 20th, and yesterday at noon we saw the end of the 30-day session. Dan and I have been working here for a long time now, and it's been quite a whirlwind, and but a great experience, and a lot got done. Dan, how are you feeling today?
Yeah, we made it through. It was a busy session. I mean, the 30 days, and we saw this year they started off busy and didn't really, take their foot off the gas pedal. I mean, 74 bills passed in 30 days, a lot of action, this week, and the fate of a few key bills kind of came down to the wire. So I'm a little tired out, but also I feel like you kind of part of the ride and an accomplishment getting through a session, and now kind of trying to see what the impact of these bills will be, and certainly if Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham decides to sign them or veto them, that's kind of the next stage of the process.
And how much time does the governor have to sign or not sign bills?
So with most bills that reach her desk in the final days of the session, she has until 20 days after the session to act on them. So that falls on March 11th this year. So she did have a press conference yesterday after the legislature adjourned, and said that with the budget bill and the tax bill, some of these kind of hefty bills, that she'll take her time kind of reading through them and deciding whether she supports them. And there's still a number of other bills also that passed in the final days of the session, including a medical malpractice bill that she's already indicated that she will sign that one. There was a lot of drama about whether the bill would be amended. And then in the end, they kind of stripped off some amendments, and in a bill in the final form, the governor, I think, supports that version of it. So, but there could be other surprises, as the governor starts reviewing bills, and we'll kind of see that play out over the next couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting to see how these bills aren't static. Oftentimes throughout the session, they get stripped down and sort of edited down as they go through the legislative process. I know the governor also pushed hard for public safety reforms. We did not see the passage of SB 17, which was the sort of big gun control bill that would have outlawed AK-47s and AR-15s, as well as AR-style pistols like Tech-9s and Uzis. Part of the issue with that bill, there were 8 amendments, I believe, filed in advance of a late-night session earlier in the week with the House Judiciary Committee that we talked about on the last podcast. And some of those at least had to do with loopholes that were in the bill that were in conflict with federal law where it came to pawn shops. And so I think just thinking about that, Dan, it seemed like an example of some legislation in trying to solve a problem sometimes becomes a bit unwieldy, a little too sweeping. Is that sort of a good assessment of maybe what happened there?
I think so. The governor did mention, disappointment over public safety bills during her news conference yesterday, and cited that bill as one of the ones she was disappointed that it didn't get across the finish line. Interestingly, she said she had tried to get legislators to maybe separate the bill and strip out that assault weapon provision from some other provisions in the bill that kind of dealt with reporting requirements for firearms dealers and things like that. But ultimately, that didn't happen. She also expressed disappointment. No bills dealing with juvenile crime were passed this year for the second year in a row, and there was a bill on the House side, that didn't get the governor's approval, and then there was a Senate bill that just didn't, advance very far. So that was another issue she expressed disappointment in. But like you said, I mean, some of these complex bills, it can be, it kind of keeps us on our toes too, whether or not they're going to make these amendments or willing to make these changes. And sometimes that happens, and other times, like we saw with the gun bill, that sponsors just decide there's too many thorny questions, and better to work on it and maybe bring it back next year for the 60-day session.
Mm-hmm. Overall, though, it sounded like the governor framed the session, her last session, of course, as as a success.
Yeah, she did. She was very complimentary of legislators, which hasn't been always been the case during her tenure as governor. She specifically highlighted the medical malpractice bill, also universal child care bill, which we went into the session. There was a lot of concern among legislators about the price tag of that. And in the end, we saw, legislators more warming to the idea. They passed a bill that kind of sets up this universal child care program and ties funding for it from a trust fund that was created a few years ago and now has $11 billion on it. So it looks like that program is kind of here to stay. We weren't sure whether or not legislators would approve of it, but they did in the end. And the governor really said, really thanked them for that work. Senator Peter Wurst said he thinks that'll really be her defining legacy, when it comes to expanding child care assistance for all New Mexico families, regardless of their income levels.
Mm-hmm. I believe she said she's on her way to Washington, D.C. next to speak to other states, other legislators about how New Mexico got that done. So that was interesting. There were a couple disappointments, I know, for the governor and for some of the legislators. There was the the Clear Horizons Act that would have codified some of the state's zero emissions goals that did not make it through the legislative process. You mentioned juvenile justice. There was a bill that would have altered the state's definition of quote unquote serious youthful offender to stiffen some of the penalties that juveniles, especially accused of violent crimes, would face. We mentioned in an early podcast that there have been a number of violent criminal cases involving juveniles across the state in 2025. So a number of things didn't get through. I was at the Republican press conference yesterday, and the session started out with some positive notes about bipartisanship, kind of setting the New Mexico legislature apart from what we see going on in Congress, at least in recent months. But I would say that in the end, it seemed like Republican leaders, there was a mix of bipartisanship. There was alignment with the governor, certainly, and Democrats on medical malpractice reforms, but there was also some kind of hardline party politics. Republicans really celebrated the defeat of SB 17, again, the gun bill, the Clear Horizons Act. And in particular, Republicans were very disappointed with a bill, I believe it was House Bill 9, that does not allow ICE detention centers in 3 of the counties in New Mexico to renew their contracts. Representative John Block, one of the youngest legislators in the Roundhouse, said that he estimates that could cause Otero County to lose 300 jobs and that it would have a pretty devastating effect on the local economy, including other businesses that are in that community because of this detention center that employs a lot of people. The legislator at the last minute did apply another piece of legislation that's going to provide some economic support, millions of dollars to those 3 communities to try and shore them up. But I know Republicans were very upset that that bill got through, and they felt like it was an example of pretty partisan politics on the part of Democrats in response to the Trump administration.
Yeah, and kind of in contrast, I was at the House Democrats press conference right after the session, and they really, championed that bill and celebrated its passage. There was a lot of immigrant rights advocates who attended that press conference. The House Speaker, Javier Martinez, has, made no bones about saying, yeah, we should help out these communities, but we can't depend on private prisons for economic development, and that New Mexico needs to be more creative about diversifying its economy. So it'll be interesting to see kind of the fate of those facilities and how that kind of plays out in the coming months once this, new legislation takes effect. But that was one, I think, as you illustrated, John, where Republicans really fought to prevent that from passage. And another reminder that, on a lot of these votes, Democrats still have the, run the show here at the Roundhouse in both the House and the Senate. They have the votes to pass bills when they really want to. I mean, we occasionally do see kind of divides in the Democratic caucus, and we saw that in the Clear Horizons Act, where some Democrats kind of joined with Republicans and voted against that bill, and that led to its failure. But on some of these real priority issues, when there is kind of real partisan kind of divides, we did see Democrats kind of flex their muscles and pass that immigration detention facility legislation. Also passed a bill the governor will be deciding on to bar troops from polling places that was inspired directly in response to President Trump's comments about nationalizing elections. So I think we saw some issues this session where the two parties were able to find bipartisan common ground on medical malpractice, things like that, and then other issues, where there were kind of these sharper divides when it comes down to party label.
And as the session wrapped up at noon yesterday, we also saw the last session for Lieutenant Governor Howie Morales. Dan, I know that you've been in the Roundhouse for many years. You've seen him under, I believe, 3 governors. Is that right? He gave a pretty inspiring, rousing speech, and you could just see the respect that he has garnered from his fellow legislators. What was your impression of how he closed out his last session?
Yeah, I think that was a moving tribute on the last day of the session. Howie Morales had been a state senator for a number of years before being elected lieutenant governor in 2018. So I've got to cover him both as a state senator and now as a lieutenant governor the last 8 years. And part of his job is presiding over the state Senate. And there's clearly a lot of, respect among both Democrats and Republicans alike. They gave him some gifts. The Republicans gave him a signed baseball and some baseball cards of the members. The Democrats had some different gifts from him as well. And, he delivered some really heartfelt remarks about, his time here and learning from other senators who have, some of them are now deceased, but kind of that ongoing wisdom that's passed down in the chamber. And, it'll be strange come next year having somebody else kind of presiding over the Senate, and a lot of the senators will be back, but he won't be, and Governor Lujan Grisham won't be as well. So that's some of the nature at the Roundhouse. Is some of the issues stay the same, but people sometimes change, and new faces will be in some of those positions. So that'll be interesting to watch, and I think interesting to see what Howie Morales does next after life in elected office.
Mhm. So you mentioned that the governor has 20 days to decide whether to sign legislation, and I believe you touched on the possibility of a special session. You were at the governor's press conference. What else did you learn there? What was your impression of how the governor is feeling as she sort of looks at her final year in office?
Yeah, she had floated the idea of calling legislators back for a special session if they didn't pass the medical malpractice bill. Since that bill was approved and she's expected to sign it into law, she said, she doesn't foresee calling a special session at this point, but also kind of left open the possibility that over the next 10 plus months, depending what happens on a federal level, that there could be a need for that. So we may not have seen the last special session called by this governor, but last year there were 2 special sessions called kind of in response to federal funding issues and food assistance benefits, things like that. So we'll see. We could be back here again, but I think for now the governor, largely lauded legislators for their work and it was more complimentary than critical. I think she said the work will go on public safety and some things like that. So we'll see how that kind of plays out. But I think for now her message was a positive one, and I think for a lot of legislators, eager to get back home and spend some time with their families, catch up on sleep, and something I know that we're both looking forward to doing a little bit as well.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to the weekend. But I know that some of the reporters here and Eddie Moore, our photographer, who again just did a great job this year covering just all over the both floors, both chambers, talking to many different people and getting great art for our stories. We were all sort of talking here in the press room just about what the session is like, and there's sort of this mix of exhaustion and also excitement and just the feeling of being in the trenches together. Especially, for you and I, Dan, who, sometimes we're working out of kind of our own shops, me up in Taos and you down here in Santa Fe. I really enjoyed that experience of being amongst not just journal colleagues, but also other newspapers around the state. It kind of is, you really being here, you really realize what an event it is for all aspects of just New Mexico, but also for New Mexico journalism. It's kind of like the Super Bowl of New Mexico journalism in some respects. All right, I was talking to Eddie, and I know Eddie really loves covering the session, and he made a good point that a lot of the time as a journalist, you're spending time reporting out stories, you're interviewing, you're doing research, and you're also figuring out, okay, what's worth covering? What do readers really care about? But at the Roundhouse, it's just like you walk out the door of the press room and you're running into a legislator or a fellow reporter or somebody who's got a news tip, or it's a particular theme day and there's a photo to shoot or a video to take. There's just no shortage of things to do, and that's been really fun. What's sort of you're probably a little more, maybe a little jaded compared to me being
Well,
in
it
my
it
first
is
session.
I think I have a love-hate relationship with the legislative session. But I think you're right. It does bring together people from all over New Mexico. You get up to speed on a lot of interesting issues. And I think the work that is done here at the Roundhouse does matter. It does affect people's lives when it comes to, building roads or criminal penalties or, tax credits for doctors like we saw in a bill this year. So I always tell people, that I am always happy when a session ends, but also kind of, miss it when it's gone, just because it is such a lively time where we learn so much. And I think I think it really kind of gets your finger on the pulse of New Mexico, which is something I enjoy. So I've been covering the Roundhouse now since 2008, and every session's a little bit different. It still kind of keeps you on your toes, and I've learned never to make any guarantees on bills, just because there is that uncertainty of how it's all going to play out. But I really, enjoyed, John, having you part of the team this year, and maybe we'll have to get back to together, do another podcast at the end of the bill signing period, and see kind of how that all shakes out.
Yeah. And thanks to all our staff as well. We had a number of reporters who came up and helped out. Our news editor, Matthew Risen, he came up and got us pizza earlier this week during one of our many late nights at the Roundhouse. So it's been an honor and a privilege to get to cover such an important part of the way New Mexico works. So thank you to all the listeners who've tuned in to Rounding Up the Roundhouse. Please visit our website, abqjournal.com. We have a new website for listeners who don't know. There's, a new look and a new feel, and we're really trying to try some new things at the Journal to sort of meet readers and people who consume news where they're at. So please check all that out. Listen to our other podcasts, and big thank you to you, Dan, for showing me the ropes this session, and we'll look forward to covering more New Mexico politics with you in the future.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Thanks to everyone, like John said, for listening and following along with our coverage. Like I said, we're looking forward to getting some rest, but we'll be jumping into election-related coverage here soon. It is a big election season this year, so don't worry. We won't be, we'll still be reporting plenty in the coming days and weeks, and look forward to seeing what lies ahead.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.